So it's Davey here, coming live on the 29th of October, 2024. It's Labs with Justin. So it's going to be a quick fire Q&A. The topics we're going to be covering today are endometriosis, polycystic ovary syndrome, and hormonal birth control, how to come off it safely, etc. So without further ado, let's talk about endometriosis. What is endometriosis, Justin?
So with endometriosis, we can see a lot of things. One of the things that sticks out most to me was a lot of women tend to have a hereditary component with endometriosis. A lot of medical literature can speak about it almost as like an autoimmune disorder. We can see low immune function in some cases of endometriosis, which makes it really interesting to me. The other piece with endometriosis is uh, there's some studies showing that women will tend to overexpress a certain enzyme in the liver that basically moves estrogen around. So we have phase one estrogen metabolism. Uh, we have this enzyme in women called CYP3A4, and it's a hydroxylated base system. Let's use layman's terms. Hydroxylation means water. So the liver is over processing a certain pathway, CYP3A4, which can cause bone to grow. That's great. But when we overexpress it, we tend to see the ability to replicate and grow endometrial tissue. So we could see a lot of that based off of immune function, uh, overexpression in the liver. In my opinion, I think of poor detoxification systems, if that's phase one, phase two, or phase three of estrogen metabolism. So it's quite complex. Standard course of care is pretty minimal. I mean, sometimes we could see some oral or intrauterine contraceptive put in place for that, but usually it takes a holistic approach, potentially alongside pharmaceutical intervention to really get to the root cause. And when I say pharmaceuticals, I don't always mean using birth control. There's a lot of alternative medicine that I think is very beneficial for endometriosis.
Okay, so let's circle back. How do you mentioned estrogen and the different phases, metabolites? How does hormonal balances impact like the progression of endometriosis?
Sure. So estrogen is proliferative by nature, meaning it helps grow things. So when we see absence of estrogen, we see menopause, loss of bone. Um, Endometriosis is basically when we're unable to clear out estrogens because we have an excess amount or we favor a negative pathway. Um, we could see the proliferation of tissue, so growth of reproductive tissue. Does that answer your question? I know I went a little bit on a
Yeah,
tangent.
it does. So it's an estrogen kind of dominant issue, low
To a
progesterone
degree,
compared
yeah. And
to
then we
progesterone.
bring immune function, maybe low cortisol output. I think probably everybody watching this has some sort of adrenal, if even if it's minimal dysfunction. So I think it's overproduction of estrogen, and then we could layer in other not comorbidities, but issues with immune function. Usually low immune function. I see issues with inflammation. That could be from the liver or just globally in the body.
But you mentioned inflammation there. What are some of the natural ways to reduce inflammation and pain for a woman that has this condition?
The first thing I would recommend, exercising. I think when we look at blood sugar utilization, a lot of people have dysfunction there. High blood sugar for prolonged periods is inflammatory. So exercise, eat right, those two typical things. I would look at stress management, stress mitigation. Um, those are probably the biggest pieces as far as lifestyle, proper sleep routine. And then we can get more specific into supplementation if that's something you want to cover.
Yeah, I was going to actually bring up supplementation. Is there any certain supplements that can help balance the hormones or estrogen with this women who have this condition?
I would say absolutely. I think it's um, being very broad. I think most of us could probably use help with detoxification of the liver. So sulforaphane, which is just broccoli sprout, you can get it concentrated in a capsule. That's really good at detoxification in general. If I don't know, I don't really know the situation. Everybody's different. That's why we recommend diagnostics. But that is an option. Tudco, which is a bile salt, which helps with bile flow. Your liver has bile ducts, so we want to make sure we're having optimal bile flow. That means the liver is just moving things appropriately. I would probably start with something like that. Omega-3 supplementation is also very good. Then we get more into herbals. I like ginger. I like curcumin. Those things are all very beneficial as well. I think it's going to be very case by case when giving supplements. Usually, recommendation for estrogen excess is to work on phase 2 and phase 3. So those are going to be more intestinal based, bowel movements, excretion based functions prior to working on the hydroxylation or water-based issues I was talking about initially. So you could look at bringing in some general supplements. When we get very specific on clearing estrogen, I think diagnostics are pretty important because we don't want to start working on a phase too early, and that can also skew things. So it's very, very individual. Hormones are very specific to each person.
Okay, can you explain in layman's terms the different phases, the one, two, and three, in terms of estrogen, how it metabolizes, etc., etc.?
Yeah. So phase 1, water-based. Uh, these are basically reactive forms of estrogen. Your body makes estrogen, or you take estrogen, or we eat it because it's in our food supply. We basically have this water-based system happening through the liver. From there, it should be met with a methyl donor. So methylation is basically just a carbon molecule. That molecule attaches to that water-based estrogen and it deactivates it. So that's called methylation. You also have sulfation. So I brought up sulforaphane, helps with sulfur donors. Um, then you have beta glucuronidation, which is phase 3. Basically, that's just an enzyme in the body that can help you reabsorb estrogen. So we don't always want that. Sometimes we want to inhibit that. You want to think about if you're unable to pass it through stool because you're constipated or you have some sort of bowel issue. There's a high chance you could reabsorb those estrogens, and then they go back through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and they never get out of your system. So they just continue to build up. And that's what I consider quote unquote estrogen dominance. There is a progesterone piece to that, but I always look at clearing out estrogen to start.
Are you a fan of DIM when it comes to lowering estrogen? It's controversial. You don't want to lower estrogen too much. It's actually, estrogen is a very powerful anti-inflammatory hormone too.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think like when we look at DIM, it goes back to that water-based issue. You have a couple enzymes that your estrogen breaks down into, 3 specifically. DIM can help you remove total estrogen burden and help you favor the less reactive form of estrogen. So I think it's fine, but we want to make sure we're using the right tool. DIM is a tool, it's in the toolbox, but we probably want to look at the detoxification processes first before just taking DIM.
Gotcha. So how does endometriosis affect fertility? Is there some hormone therapies to improve the fertility outcomes?
Yeah, I would say I'm probably less versed on the specifics around reproductive organ and function with fertility. Usually, my assumption with that is first off, if immune function is low and your body's fighting for homeostasis every day, that's going to be a big issue with fertility. I think about inflammation being just like kind of low-hanging fruit. Those are the things I'd probably address first. Then if we look at reproductive organs, fibroids, cysts, blocks in fallopian tubes, all of those things can impact fertility when we have abnormal growth to reproductive tissue. So honestly, I think it's a multitude of factors. It usually is, but I usually will focus on addressing those first two before really diving in and looking at other issues. That's just my opinion. I'm not a medical provider, but that seems to have worked. I've actually helped a couple people with PCOS not endometriosis, but PCOS, be able to conceive. And those were the things that we started on initially.
Okay, one last question on endometriosis. What role does certain pharmaceuticals play in healing, in reversing, helping with endometriosis? And is birth control, a lot of doctors give women birth control to help as well. What's your viewpoint on that?
Yeah, birth control, a lot of people demonize it. I don't demonize any drug. I like to think about the reason behind using a drug. So if someone has a lot of abnormal growth to reproductive organs, maybe some of those are cancer positive, or they've had, risks or previous biopsies, it will keep that endometrial lining from growing. So life or death situation, it probably would be something I would take and then work on those other two things I spoke about. So I think there's application there. Do I think it's what I would want to do personally? No, but I could see why practitioners do it. Um, when I think about alternative medicine or things used for off-label use, bioidentical progesterone seems to be very effective here. It's going to do everything a progestin-based Mirena, IUD, or whatever form of synthetic hormone you're using. I would recommend the bioidentical format of that. Um, Progesterone's important in contraceptive, or I'm sorry, in conceiving. Um, so I would probably look at that. And then honestly, I really liked when we're looking at immune function, inflammation, several peptides that are very helpful for improving immune function and reducing inflammation in the body. I really think of them as an in-between of holistic medicine and full-blown pharmaceutical. Peptides are something that I like to bridge the gap with.
Specifically for low immune system peptides,
Immune function
inflammation.
and inflammation. Yep.
Gotcha. Very helpful. Moving on.
Yes.
Sorry, you're saying something?
I said maybe we can cover the peptides at a different time, but that'll be quite a conversation. So maybe a future Q&A.
Definitely. We'll focus on hormone health and women's health today. Let's move on to polycystic ovary syndrome, PCOS. What is it? What causes PCOS?
Yeah, PCOS, polyovarian cystic spectrum. It's not a syndrome, it's a spectrum because there's so many things that can fall into it. So a lot of people will have misdiagnosis or just generalized diagnosis. It's like we don't know where it's coming from, but you have cystic ovaries, that's one of the diagnosis. Excess androgens, that's another diagnosis. Um, Inflammation-based issues,
Post
adrenal,
pill.
you could see that. I don't know if I brought up the inflammation piece, I'm sorry, the insulin resistance piece, but what I will tell you when we're looking at all five of the quote unquote diagnosis, it's four or five. Usually inflammation and insulin resistant are somewhere in that triage of things. It's not always just cystic ovaries, in my opinion. I usually see other factors playing into that end role of having cystic ovaries or infertility. So it's a spectrum. There's a lot of things. Someone could be very much at the beginning of that spectrum and not be able to get a diagnosis, but have all of the symptoms of PCOS. So, I don't like to put labels on things. I think that it can be very much uh, manifestation into that disease state. And usually it happens very young because there's a very strong hereditary component with PCOS as well. Um, I see a lot of women with just excess androgen and then insulin resistance. I would say at least 50 to 60% of the diagnostics that I do, there's some form of insulin resistance there.
It's the most common form of PCOS, insulin resistance. What are the symptoms? Oily skin, acne, facial hair, hair loss, obviously cysts on the ovaries. What are
Cystic,
how is the woman diagnosed? Is it through their
she needs
doctors?
one of those classifications. So her provider is going to need to rule out all of the other symptoms, or maybe it's multifactorial, but she's going to need to have the hirsutism, so the loss of hair on the scalp and growing hair in abnormal places, cystic ovaries, excess adrenal hormones. You can get a diagnosis for many things, but a lot of times these are like very much on the cusp, and someone's not full blown, if that's insulin resistance or high androgen, low SHBG, and that can kind of sit there for some time, and disease state can manifest. So I think that the diagnosis could be a lot of things. And sometimes I hear women say, "Oh, I had PCOS. They never told me which kind. They just kind of gave me that label." I've spoke with someone last week like that. So a lot of things can fit into that.
But can you have a mixture of insulin resistance PCOS with inflammatory PCOS? A combination of one or two or three, or is it just one?
I usually see a sometimes one, I think, probably not as common, but it's usually a couple different things kind of bleeding into that quote unquote diagnosis. It's usually not just one thing. We had a message come through the chat. Can you have PCOS or the symptoms without cysts? Absolutely. Yeah, the cystic ovaries are just a symptom. There's a lot of other symptoms that can tie into that.
How is it confirmed on labs? Is it free testosterone, total testosterone, a certain number, or is there other markers, ferritin, or but what do you look at on labs when diagnosing or confirming PCOS?
Yeah, I can't confirm or diagnose, but if when I look at it and I'm talking through with somebody is there's a couple things. Usually we're going to have higher free androgen, so like a free testosterone. We do a really nice job here and we look at a dihydrotestosterone. So that's a reduced version of testosterone. It's a more potent metabolite. It's what put you and I through puberty and turned us into men. Women make it, but they make it a lesser amount. It really only becomes problematic for them when they have less of a specific marker called sex hormone binding globulin. That's a binding protein made in the liver. And that it's almost like a net. SHBG has a very high affinity rate for DHT. Layman's terms, it's like a net. It will pick up all the excess DHT and keep it inactive. Well, one of the things with insulin resistance is uh, the sex hormone binding globulin tends to decrease in insulin resistant people. So they have lower amounts of these binding proteins. So that same amount of very potent androgen can then attach to your navel, attach to your upper lip, attach to your hair follicle, and start to see the manifestations of hair loss. If we're looking at other symptoms that I see really commonly, high sensitive C-reactive protein. So HSCRP will be elevated. I can see elevations in ferritin, usually glucose, insulin, hemoglobin A1C. Those are going to be skewed. The other piece with PCOS is I usually see with a lot of people some sort of liver dysfunction. So maybe low production of antioxidants via the liver, glutathione. Um, it's a lot of different things. The last thing and the thing I like is I usually support our clients here with some literature if they ask for it. And we can see a change in LH and FSH. So if we're trying to catch somebody between day 19 and 21, usually you're going to have more FSH than LH. A lot of times what I'll see is the inverse, that luteinizing hormone is rarely high and we have a very low LH, or maybe half or a third of the pulse. Well, the ovaries are very intelligently designed, and the ovaries produce androgens and estrogens. So LH helps that pulse of making androgens like testosterone. FSH has an enzyme that converts those androgens into estrogen. When we have excess androgens and insulin resistance, we have less pulse of FSH. So all the androgens we're making, we can see that they're not converting to estrogen at that same rate they should. And then we have excess DHT, we have low SHBG, we're inflamed. So it's kind of like endometriosis. It's a lot of different things together, but there's usually a lot of data on labs with symptoms where we can pick things apart.
Interesting. So how does PCOS affect menstrual cycles? And is there any natural way to restore the menstrual cycles?
Yeah, usually I see the loss of progesterone when we start to have ovulation defects. So progesterone won't surge at that right time of the month, or we have excess androgens driving down that FSH, causing irregularities with LH, and then we may not peak progesterone appropriately. Progesterone has a very protective benefits for reproductive organs. And we could potentially see that we're not making progesterone. So if someone were to conceive or, implant an egg, that progesterone is not there to protect that lining, that sheath that protects the baby. So we usually see a loss of pregnancy. We see a lot of women using bioidentical progesterone for fertility measures when someone conceives to kind of backfill those lost hormones because of the PCOS.
Okay, so you mentioned fertility there. Is that a lot of doctors prescribe birth control? It does manage the symptoms. What's your
For
view
sure.
on birth control and PCOS? Because it's demonized, but it does kind of help in a way too. So you mentioned bioidentical progesterone. Which is the most effective? Both have their pros and cons. Depends.
Everything is a double-edged sword. Absolutely.
I'm cortisol. What role does cortisol play in PCOS? It's
Yeah, yeah.
stress.
I think that is another important piece. So I was actually very fortunate to work with an OBGYN who specialized in fertility. We would always look at adrenal function. So 17-OH progesterone, it's a metabolite. Sometimes that can be in excess of adrenal hormone. So, not necessarily cortisol, but somewhere around that same standpoint, that can reduce into more potent metabolites. Usually what I see with a lot of women with cortisol, when we're looking at cortisol with PCOS is uh, some majority of the time I would say low cortisol function, but that's pretty standard for most people. But cortisol being low in a PCOS state, and we don't have an appropriate CAR, we're losing the ability to have anti-inflammatory benefits of cortisol in the morning. So cortisol is usually flatlined. Cortisol is very good at suppressing melatonin, helping you wake up. Within that first hour, it's going to work off the thymus gland. It's going to have very pronounced anti-inflammatory effects, kind of clean up DNA damage. With low cortisol function, we usually don't get that same uh, mop and broom to clean up all of the damaged DNA. So that's across the board, but I see that with PCOS, and it just seems to exacerbate inflammatory states.
Gotcha. Let's talk about weight loss and solution. For women that have PCOS, takes a different approach. So
I see
would you
a lot of
suggest, obviously the same as endometriosis, you need to really clean up the diet, the quality of food matters. Would you suggest a lower carb approach or a calorie cycling approach in and around the
it.
workouts to help in insulin sensitivity?
It depends on the individual. If she is purely insulin resistant, and that's the reason, I'm actually going to spend a lot of time working on insulin sensitivity. That may be higher fat, lower carbohydrate for periods, and then using carbohydrates around training. So yes, to what you're saying, but it's very circumstantial on each case. What I will tell you is anybody watching this, even if you think you're really healthy, we all probably need to clean up our diet. I think I eat really well, but that's just a general statement. So I would say people in general should just eat better. But I do think that that's a piece of it. Losing weight tends to be one of the other things when I see PCOS. If we have insulin resistance, and we're gonna have a really hard time mobilizing free fatty acids and burning them. So yeah, I would say those are the two most important things: lifestyle, nutrition, and then get more nuanced into what specific areas you need to work on.
So what supplements are helpful for controlling blood sugars? How much of an impact does inositol or chromium or berberine have with a woman who has PCOS? Or are they overrated, or do those supplements genuinely work?
Yeah, well, if you are not eating better and exercising, no pharmaceutical or no supplement will really move the needle. I mean, Ozempic will, but you'll lose all your muscle and alongside other things because you don't have those lifestyle habits put in place. Uh, I do think that using things like um, inositol, chromium, cinnamon, apple cider vinegar, berberine are very impactful if we're being mindful of our nutrition. Maybe we are calorie cycling. we're improving insulin sensitivity through nutrition, and then we bring in nutraceuticals on top of it, I definitely think it moves the needle. I'm not opposed to pharmaceuticals. I like metformin probably more than all of them, but it has its negatives and it's also prescription based. So if someone is trying to improve symptoms from home, they don't want to go to the doctor, they haven't had success, nutrition, lifestyle, and then you could layer in some of those supplements. And I do think it would be instrumental to help you progress with PCOS.
Very helpful. We've covered endometriosis, we've covered PCOS. Before I move on to our last topic, Charlotte, thanks for joining. Do you want to chip in with any knowledge? Because I believe you did have suffered from PCOS in the past.
Sorry, I was dropping off my nieces, so that's why I was late. Um, PCOS has been a weird one for me because none of my sisters have it, my mom doesn't have it, no one in my family has it. So I thought it was interesting that you saw a lot of people with generation of PCOS. I was like, oh, that's weird. So that was just my own unique scenario. But I it came back kind of like crazy after my liver dysfunction happened. I had taken care of it pretty much with keto or low carb. And then it kind of came back with a vengeance in this last 3 months of like really horrific pain. But I accrued it to a lot of liver issue because I had my liver enzyme super high. And then obviously I think hormonally something happened. And then now I've been able to get it back under control with castor oil packs and certain herbal teas. My periods have been a lot less painful. So that's kind of an interesting note for women who are really suffering with horrifically painful periods or cysts bursting even before their cycle starts, because that's what was happening to me again. Um, so I do agree with Justin, and I had high, I think irregular blood sugars even before that. Though I think there's something in me that I haven't fixed yet. Underlying toxins and infections. I haven't done parasite cleansing yet. I haven't done this other stuff that maybe move the needle even more, so this stuff doesn't come back. And I think that's one thing that I have been connecting. Why does the PCOS, why did the cysts even grow in the first place? Like, what is causing that to grow? It could be, well, we trigger it to blood sugars and testosterone's off and, maybe diet and lifestyle. But a part of me feels like there's something even deeper that we're missing as a whole, as far as why it even happens in the first place. And then we're looking at all these symptoms, these by symptoms of when it's already there. Because when I went to the doctor, she's like, I don't really know if you have endo or you have PCOS. I can't really tell. I'm like, oh, okay. So that was a long time ago, but that's just kind of my 2 cents on it. It's still kind of a mystery to me of like the deeper reason why so many women are developing it and what is actually truly causing it. Because we're kind of hitting the symptoms of like, this is how you know it's there by these symptoms, but what is actually causing it? Does that make sense?
Does. It could be a
So
number of
that's kind of where
things.
I'm at. Yeah.
Environmental toxins,
So,
stress, genetics,
mhm.
mainly.
Yeah, I'll let you know because I'm gonna keep trying to pursue this detox thing. So I'll let you know how much it takes care of it myself. So then I don't have to do all this stuff before the cycle starts because I'm always scared shitless, essentially, like how much pain I'm gonna be in. So it'll be I'm ready to cure this thing if it's curable in the most completely natural way possible without having to do all these supplements. So I guess I'll be the tester and I'll let you guys know how it goes.
There is no cure as such. Maybe I'm wrong here, but we can control the symptoms.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
it's
would agree.
about not curing it.
Yeah, I would say like, you could probably get rid of the majority of the symptoms. And when you go through menopause, all of your hormones will decline. So you probably wouldn't have any of those. But I would say you may ebb and flow with that. I don't think it's an autoimmune. I don't think of it as autoimmune disease, but I think of it in a sense of like an autoimmune disease. You can have ebbs and flows and reduction of antibodies or maybe reduction of androgens. But depending on lifestyle nutrition, you can kind of fall back into those same suits. So I think that your genes probably dictate a lot of that, and your lifestyle environment can basically turn those genes on and create that mismanagement or irregular cascades of hormones, in my personal opinion.
Yeah, that's fair. I don't even know. Like I'm just shooting out stuff because I'm always the person like, well, how do I take this to the next level and figure this out? Because I've already done like the nutrition and the supplement route, and I can basically maintain less with different things that I'm doing, but I'm always curious. Because I was talking to another client and her sister actually did a parasite cleanse with Cellcore and she didn't have tough periods after that. She said everything went back to normal. So I do wonder if there is some other thing. And this would not be every single woman should, this would cure every single woman. This is just case by case scenario, depending on what was in her body, I guess. It's not fair to say that it'll take care of everyone. I don't think that's true. But I am curious to see, if we had more women doing some of this stuff, how many layers would it peel off? And would they still have to use as much stuff, essentially?
That's a good perspective for sure.
Yeah. But yeah, PCOS is a tough one. It's really tough. Not fun.
It's stubborn. It's when it comes to weight loss, it's not easy. It takes a way longer approach, a deeper deficit. But you've
Hmm.
seen that with clients.
And that's what I always tell clients. And like, hey, you've been in this dysfunction or disease state for 10 years. It's going to take us longer than 4 months to fix it. So I think being patient, it's a process, it's a journey for sure.
Justin, do you notice that a lot of people gain weight in their stomach when they have PCOS? Like there's a trend, like they just get like this tire around their stomach. That's what happens to me. Like I gain all my weight in my stomach and it's just very fluctuating. And I think a lot of women are like, how do I get rid of this? I don't gain it in my hips or my legs or my arms. It's always in my stomach. So is that a common trend that you see too
I
with
think if it's
PCOS?
low-grade insulin resistance is probably the thing I
Hmm.
see most. The thing I think
Okay.
of like misdiagnosis or someone not getting the care they need, we have to factor in visceral fat. So if someone is insulin resistant for 10 years, maybe they are gaining through their midsection, but you have to think about your organs are being impacted by that. So even if there's reduction in weight, maybe really hard to get off that last bit around the midsection, or if you always feel bloated or excess belly. I always think of internal organs carrying fat. And then it's a more in-depth conversation about fasting mimicking diets. But I do think that there's ways to improve that. And yeah, I would say midsection tends to be an issue. Uh, Similar to like the hair loss or the facial hair growth. It's going to be dependent, but it's a pretty common theme.
Hmm. Yeah.
There's a lot of
Well,
different marketing terms out there, isn't there, guys? Belly. You mentioned PCOS belly. Shout out. There's menopause belly,
mm.
apparently. There's belly, cortisol belly.
Cortisol belly, all gluten belly.
Yeah, for real.
Move on to the last topic, a very controversial topic. It's hormonal birth control. So, how does hormonal birth control impact natural hormone levels? What are the long-term effects on a woman's body?
Yeah, it's a touchy subject for sure. Uh, in my opinion, I'm not a huge fan of birth control unless we're trying to stop proliferation of cancer. That would probably be one of my only reasons where I'd be like, you should totally do that. That makes sense. Um, how many days out of a month can a woman get pregnant? I don't know the exact day. I think it's like 2 or 3 days. There's not a large window where Sophie, how many?
I think it's like, yeah, like 3 or 4 days or something. And I think if women started to like basal body temperature are amazing ways to start tracking your period and being aware of also like I forgot what the method is called, but like our like the secretions
Yes.
as well, and just being aware of our body is 10 million times better than trying to avoid pregnancy through birth control. Because even then, like I have friends who have gotten pregnant despite being on birth control as well. And I think it just causes a lot more issues than actually helping if that's the only reason that you're taking it. Then there's so many other ways to go about it, especially like even like painful periods and all those things as well. Like there's a reason that those things are happening. And I had a friend that was like, well, my period, like I'm regular. I'm like, but that isn't your actual period. And I think women aren't aware what birth control actually is. and it's taken very, very lightly. I've been suggested to take birth control 2 times in my life by a gynecologist because I was very irregular. And I remember like I just left the second time. I'm like, I'm gonna go figure this out on my own because I'm not getting the help that I needed. And it was through lifestyle changes, through my diet, through being aware of like the products that I use, that I was able to create that regularity back in my period versus trying to depend on the birth control. But yeah, it's like 3 or 4 days. Like it's not. I'm not sure exactly like what the day is, the exact days, but it's just like the day of ovulation for sure, and then like maybe the day if you before, because sperm can live for like 3 or 4 days or something like that within the uterus, but any more than that, then it's impossible.
So
There's a
I
really good
agree.
app, the Natural Cycles app. Right? That's what I look at. The red, obviously, you cannot do the deed on those certain days. It's like 7 days out of a month, I think, max. That it's impossible for a woman not to get pregnant.
So that's probably the one of the reasons I would absolutely not use it. So I'm in full agreement. Like maybe do some leg in work and figure out like those specific times of the month. Um, when we look at it from like long-term side effects, well, we're seeing some things now as far as like hypothyroidism after long-term birth control use. Uh, I usually see a downregulation in sex hormones, especially as a woman ages. So hypothyroidism, maybe early onset perimenopause. I usually see, well, you're taking a hormone that's going to disrupt your pituitary to your ovaries. There's an axis there. We spoke about LH and FSH earlier on this call. It will skew that and cause your body to be infertile. I mean, that's what contraceptive is. So when we do that, we can expect other hormones. Hormones and the endocrine system is a symphony, and all of the instruments are playing together. And as soon as we start to have one instrument stop working or become dysfunction, the whole symphony is thrown off. And we can see that all of these things will tend to bleed into each other. So you could see from hypothyroidism to perimenopause. Really high sex hormone binding globulin is another side effect of birth control. So if a woman is making appropriate amounts of testosterone and estrogen and thyroid hormone for her body, those binding proteins may hold on to it and not allow them to free circulate. So there's a lot of things that can be attributed to birth control use. As far as dysfunction, some of the biggest things that I think women should be aware of is the issues with thyroid function, because I have seen that several times. People very much right on the cusp of hypothyroidism or full-blown hypothyroidism from long-term birth control use. There's a study that shows 15 years of consecutive birth control use was linked to hypothyroidism. The other things is if you're putting an IUD in your body, you're also exposing yourself to excess heavy metals. I mean, there's just so many reasons. I'm not a woman, so I'm not saying don't use it, but there's so many reasons I would educate myself before just letting someone put an implant on in me, or I take a pill every day.
Yeah, then there's the whole impact on mood, on libido, on gut health, and the thyroid, and the drains very important nutrients from the body
Yeah.
too. Folate, B6, like zinc. Women need to be aware of the side effects
I met
long
with
term as
some
well.
similar issue. She's going through a program right now. Was on birth control because recently went through a separation, and it was purely for contraceptive. And she's like, "Oh, I've been on it 3 years, and I'm starting to have all of these symptoms. I'm gaining weight. I'm having all of these issues with libido." And I was like, I'm just giving you the things. I'm trying to point out potentially why you're having these issues. And I think potentially it is probably the birth control use, mid 40s, no other reason outside of contraceptives. So we spent some time and became educated on tracking cycle and other ways to do that. I'm not a huge fan of copper IUD, but I would probably do that over hormonal birth control if somebody were going to do that. Um, just my 2 cents, that those are what I see to work best with most women.
It's one of the questions I ask potential clients on a call before they come into the program. Are you on any specific medication? It's not uncommon for women in their late 40s and early 50s to say, yeah, I'm on an IUD, which is at that stage of life, I'm sure it's not doing them any favors, but their doctor prescribed them.
Absolutely. You know, I think a lot of people want to use those drugs because they're synthetic forms of estrogen or progesterone. And I have seen some people use Yaz and which is an estrogen-based birth control, and it may help a little bit with symptoms. But my thoughts on that is if you're going through menopause or you're having perimenopause symptoms, you should use bioidentical hormones. If you're going to use a pharmaceutical, which I am an advocate of, why don't you take what your body already produces or used to produce? You probably will handle that drug a lot better.
Yeah, I read somewhere that 80% of women have been on some form of birth control over the age of 40 in their life, but only 4% have been on bioidenticals, as you said. But what's the difference between the synthetic birth control and then the bioidentical?
Yeah, it could be as simple as additions of uh, different molecules. So we look at like uh, how the medication is basically set up or the drug is set up. It could have extra methyl groups. It could have extra acetyl groups. They're usually methylated, so the liver has to process them. They're synthetic, so they're made in a laboratory. So they're very similar to what we make, but maybe they're a couple molecules off. So when we metabolize them, we may not break them down appropriately. We talked about detoxification systems. Our bodies don't really know how to handle foreign forms of hormones. And most of the education around hormones was based off of the Health Initiative study in 2009. All of those were synthetic hormones, and they didn't account for smoking, high blood pressure, multitude of things. But if we look at bioidenticals, there's exact structure our body makes. They are made in a laboratory, but they are 17 beta estradiol. It's going to be the same exact type of estradiol your body produces. So we tend to be able to metabolize that and use it more efficiently and know how to break it down.
And if we're not doctors, we're not telling people to come off birth control, but if they were to say, give me some advice how to come off it safely, what's some tips, strategies could we advise nutritionally wise or supplements just so
Yeah,
that they come off safely?
I think all the coaches probably have a lot of good information on this. I think of anti-inflammatory diet, lots of antioxidants, micronutrients. My personal opinion, I like to start to give raw materials to the ovaries. That could be pregnenolone. That maybe could be DHEA, depending on a multitude of other things. But I like to think about supporting the ovaries in that hormonal process. Pregnenolone is the beginning of all sex hormones. It's basically a transition from cholesterol into a master hormone. So I like to support with pregnenolone, potentially DHEA. Um, Usually progesterone is something I see very low in women who are using birth control, but maybe women in general. Trace berry tree extract. Um, those are things that I think are helpful. And then the things we harp on always, lifestyle, nutrition, exercise, those are the real big needle movers long term.
Does it take long for natural sex hormone production kind of start again? 'Cause we've seen
It,
labs where women in their 20s, like 30s, and the sex hormone profile is very low. Even it's during the early luteal phase that the bloods are taken. So does it take long for naturally come back to normal? Depends.
depends. I wish I could give like a straight answer, like 8 weeks. 8 weeks, you'll be rocking and rolling. It depends. Depends on all of those other statuses. All depends on your health status. Depends on how young you are. Usually, younger women I see tend to bounce back better. Thyroid downregulation is something that I see younger women tend to struggle with birth control. So if that's gastrointestinal based, if that's pituitary based, but there is a strong correlation with the hypothyroidism. What I will tell you with women 40, 45 plus, postmenopausal, no, I think it's going to be very hard to restore hormones. It will take time. I'm not saying you can't do it. Postmenopause, your hormones don't come back, but if you're in a peri, you may start to improve some of these things. But I think it's going to be a process for sure. I don't think it's a quick turnaround.
that covers all the Q&A, unless the ladies want to chip in with their feedback. It was a good session.
Listen, what did you say? The birth control, how does it affect hypothyroid again? What was the mechanisms that it stopped
So you're
or
inhibiting
slowed down?
you're inhibiting the hypothalamus pituitary. So those are
Okay.
signaling hormone cascades. As we take birth control, it can disrupt that process. It's similar to a male taking anabolic steroids. He shuts down his own production of fertility as he starts to introduce exogenous hormones. People use steroids, will use synthetic forms of steroids, and those can be very suppressive to uh, uh, the cascade of making sex hormones. Thyroid hormone is going to be pulsed in a similar fashion.